That everybody, I think, is here. Welcome to a night in the John Oxley Library. Tonight we're talking about Queensland places, and it's a fairly broad topic, and we've got a couple of experts here in places and tourism and railways, so I thought we'd sort of narrow it down a bit to tourism and railways and how Queensland places tie in to tourism and railways and how they developed as places. And the concept of places itself is interesting. We'll speak to Peter Spearritt about that shortly. On the tables over there, as you know, there are lots of posters. You might have had a chance to have a quick look before we started, but we'll take a closer look a bit later. They're tourism posters of places in Queensland mostly, also real estate posters, and there's some tea towels and teacups, things that the John Oxley Library have collected. Very beautiful and very evocative pieces of artwork, the posters especially, aren't they? 1920s and 30s right up to the 60s and 70s. So in Queensland, probably more so than other states, we've had a climate, I think, and the railway system to really market places as places to visit. There's this idealised version of Queensland that's been marketed over the years, beaches and palm trees and the perfect places for a holiday. So that's what I think we'll look at tonight. And I mean, I'm really interested in how does a name become a place, or a place embody a name? And I've actually been interested in this since I've had kids. So you go to all this trouble, don't you, of naming your kids. My kids are Charlotte, Josephine and Gabrielle. And they, initially that sounded very odd. I wasn't quite sure whether I got the names right, but eventually the people grow into the names. The names sort of adopt the personality. And I'm pretty sure that's the case with places, and Cairns and Noosa and the Whitsundays evoke that sort of personality. They've taken on a personality. And the name Queensland, of course, too. Originally Queensland, not very exciting. Perhaps images of Queen Victoria in black and patriotism, but that's, there's a poster over there, a fantastic poster with tropical fruit surrounding the name Queensland, and I always think of Queensland with the yellow, the pineapple yellow and the banana yellow. Our guests tonight are Andrew Moritz and Peter Spearritt, and Andrew's the director of the fabulous Workshop Rail Museum at Ipswich, and if you've ever been to the workshops, you'll know what a great museum it is. I've taken my kids there quite a bit over the years. It's one of the most successful museums in the country, and Andrew's been overseeing it for more than a decade. And Professor Peter Spearritt teaches, amongst other things, urban history and coastal development, and he's written many books, including the Historical Atlas of Queensland. And he's also the director, I think you're still the director of the Centre for the Government of Queensland, Peter?
Extraordinarily, although I'm not responsible for all current appointments.
You don't take responsibility, but you have an interesting project, or you've had an interesting project on Queensland places, so you're the place person, Peter. I suppose we should define what we're talking about a bit. If we're thinking generally of places, what do we mean? Communities, towns, places where people congregate, I guess.
Well, I guess in terms of tourism, what most marks Queensland out is its tendency to name some of its coasts. So, of course, the places get their names normally sometime between about 1820 through. We probably don't have as many places in Queensland with Indigenous names as you do in some other states, although that's changing in more recent times because often national parks have been renamed very sensibly with an Indigenous name that means something. But the ones that have always fascinated me have been the issue of the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast.
Yes.
Because as quite a few of you probably know, a lot of people on the Gold Coast in the 1950s were still calling it the Sunshine Coast, and the guidebooks in the early 1950s were called a guidebook to the South Coast, and everybody in Queensland was supposed to know what the South Coast was. Goodness knows what anybody from Sydney would have thought. It was literally just called Penrod's Guide to the South Coast. And the guidebooks for what we now call the Sunshine Coast were often just called the Near North Coast. And then the Gold Coast, of course, emerges as a description, I suppose, really of Main Beach to Coolangatta, but you wouldn't want to be including anything in New South Wales in the Gold Coast, would you?
So the Gold Coast does stop at the border.
So the Gold Coast stops at the border, because I think I mentioned when Ian and I were having a chat beforehand, intriguingly, the Coolangatta Airport doesn't. 2/3 of it's in Queensland and 1/3 in New South Wales, but the Gold Coast stops at the border. Whereas with the case of the Sunshine Coast, there was a bitter argument within Nambour about whether, because that's where the main council was, whether they should market themselves as the Sunshine Coast, because that was flippant, it involved young women in bikinis, and it didn't involve any agriculture. So there was quite a lot of...
Well, you wouldn't want people visiting, just for people in bikinis.
Certainly not.
There's agriculture that's much more attractive for visitors. So when did this marketing push start?
The marketing push for the Gold Coast is well underway by the late 50s, but the Sunshine Coast marketing really doesn't start until the early 60s.
And so it's basically when people had access to cheap cars and the roads were built, so you could
the roads
visit quite easily.
The roads are better. But at the time, of course, as most of you will appreciate, just looking around at the mean and median age, and I think Olivia Robinson's in the background there somewhere. A few years back I gave a talk at the Nambour Council, and I showed them one of those fold-out postcards, and everybody in the room was about 25 to 35, and they simply couldn't believe a map of the Sunshine Coast which showed Maroochydore, Cotton Tree, Alexandria, Headland, Mooloolaba, all its tiny little villages. They literally couldn't get their heads around the idea that these really were separate places. They had their own post office. They're proper little communities, and of course they're grown up in a linear coastal development era. Couldn't get their head around that at all.
So the marketing system worked in a way. The region became the Sunshine Coast. All those little communities became a sort of conglomerate.
They did, except when it came to the Beattie government's amalgamation of the three councils. Because each council had its own, you'll know, each council had its own marketing campaign. Right. And now that Noosa has been allowed out, courtesy of Bob Ansett and Darl, they're starting their own marketing campaign.
Right, and the airline tie-in there as well. You mentioned Bob Ansett.
Oh, the airline tie-in, well, you can see in the posters over there that TAA and Ansett were incredibly important in marketing the Gold Coast, especially in Sydney and Melbourne in the 1950s and 1960s. And I make this grand claim with no empirical evidence at all. We'd have to codge up an opinion poll that most people in Sydney and Melbourne had their first experience of living in an apartment when they rented one on the Gold Coast. That would be the first time in their lives that they actually would have lived in an apartment.
Yes.
But, this is in the 50s, 60s and early 70s. Yeah.
So the airlines were sort of partly responsible, I guess, for opening up that sort of tourism conglomerate of the Sunshine Coast, and they were used, but originally it was railways, wasn't it?
That's right.
Andrew. So the railways were instrumental in Queensland in marketing Queensland places. What role did the railways have in linking communities, especially in Queensland, and getting people to visit for pleasure?
Look, the railway story in Queensland is quite different to the story in the southern states, where the railway radiated out, if you like, from the capital cities. In Queensland, you see three separate railway networks that are not integrated as one until 1924, with the Sunshine, or the route up the coast through to Cairns, is completed in 1924. And so at that point you start to see a big push to get more through trains and more transport of visitors and the public moving up and down the coast on trains. Previous to that, it had been days' worth of travel to get north. And suddenly the railway turned that into something that could be achieved both in a more economical sense, both for time and cost. And so you start to see the railway get involved in promoting the opportunities travelling north and the use of their trains. As we were talking about previously as well, it's again, it's a little bit different to the southern states, where you see the railways actually do what the airlines did in the 70s and 80s, which was create resorts to create the demand for their services. So you see railway resorts in Victoria, in particular in the high country.
Even though the train didn't bloody well.
Even though the train never got you there. Yes,
wasn't
it absolutely. You actually had to complete the journey on the bus, if you like. But
So these were government railway resorts.
they were government railway resorts. Mount Buffalo, Caves. Yep.
In neither case would the
Train
get
actually
you there.
get you there. But it was, and again, like the airlines, a thing about getting capacity and getting people on services to take you places to use the railway. You don't see Queensland Rail in some respects do that here in Queensland. And I guess I'm not fully aware of what the issues were as to why they didn't develop resorts, given that others were. But certainly you see from 1924 that great push to get people on their trains up and down the coast.
That's so the transport industry has really had an interest in tourism, and in Victoria and New South Wales, the railways had the resorts, and we've seen the airlines involved in resorts in Queensland.
Here also owning, in effect. I mean, for a while they owned Hayman
Island,
and some
Dunk,
I mean, they
yep.
really were. I don't know how often they owned the freehold, but they certainly had leasehold arrangements on a number of the islands, Hamilton Island and so on. Yeah.
What was in it for the government to actually own the resort? Was it profits, or was it something more, community responsibility, encouraging industries?
Look, I think certainly in the southern states it was about encouraging the use of the railway, and so the profits were generated in some respects not only from the operation of the hotel, as it were, but from the actual transport and travel arrangements that were supplying visitors to those resorts.
And in Queensland too, the Queensland government would have benefited from advertising the railway routes up the coast to the...
Oh, absolutely. I don't know that I've managed to find one of these yet for the John Oxley collection, but the Percy Tromp poster, the nasty things the Queensland Government Tourist Bureau did to Melburnians in the 1930s cannot be exaggerated. They'd have a big Percy Tromp poster up in the railway station, Richmond railway station on a cold winter's night, and it said, "Go north for warmth." And you'd have a family of penguins walking towards the Queensland railway system to then be able to go to Cairns.
Did it work?
Which would have been days on the train, not weeks.
And crossing state borders where there were different gauges. How difficult was it to get up from the south by train to Queensland? You'd have to change several times, wouldn't you?
Can you do the route for us, Andrew? I mean, you had to change at Wollongara.
Yes, well, coming from, if you were coming from Melbourne, you would have changed at Albury, at the break of gauge station at Albury. You then would have come in effectively via Sydney, I would imagine.
Sydney.
Yep, and then up to Wollongara, where you would have broke a break of gauge station as well.
Now, how many people here have been to Wollongara? Because those of you who haven't, if you're out at Stanthorpe sometimes, it's absolutely bloody unbelievable. It's an 1880s railway station.
Yep.
It's built right on the border.
So the border actually does exactly what the airport does, and it kind of crosses across the middle of the platform.
And then the railway station, the 1880s railway station, is designed in two different styles. It's got it's unbelievable to see.
It's got a Queensland veranda and a New South Wales veranda.
It's well worth it. Really is almost.
It's
well
quite
worth the visit.
amazing.
Well, they resurveyed the border some years ago, probably about 10 years ago now, and they discovered that some streets in Wollongara, instead of being in Queensland, were actually in New South Wales. And there was a big...
What's the community? It's got a different name, hasn't it? The township on the New South Wales side. I think it's starting.
Yeah.
It's got a different name to Wollongara.
Now look, when did we start marketing Queensland for tourists? Going right back then. When was tourism? When was it popular for people from somewhere else to visit Queensland places?
Well, the first government in the world to market its bit of territory was the colony of Tasmania in the 1890s. And then the first nation in the world to have a tourist bureau was New Zealand. Now you might remark that they're both islands a lot of people haven't heard about, and perhaps they needed to market themselves. I mean, it's interesting, it's Tasmania, then New Zealand. New South Wales Government Tourist Bureau set up in about 1905 and Queensland shortly after. But as Andrew would know, I think the Queenslanders were very conscious of how heavily the New South Wales and Victorian railway systems were into marketing.
Absolutely.
All the railway commissioners would have been really well aware of that.
Absolutely, yes, they absolutely would have been very well aware of that. And I guess it just goes to show the dominance of the railway system in not only Queensland but the southern states. You know, these were big, enormous enterprises that were soaking up employment and providing lots of employment through the states, which is why governments loved them in many respects, and building railway lines and building trains to travel on those railway lines brought about enormous employment opportunities. But they were the kind of conglomerate organisations that were running all sorts of things. Obviously, we've talked about resorts, but in Queensland, again, for a while there, before the route was finished, Queensland Rail is one of the few railways that actually ran shipping up and down the coast to connect their trains at different points along the route where the railway line actually hadn't been built. So these were enormous business units.
Because the last bit that's built is the Townsville. What's the very last bit that's built?
It is that very north.
Bowen to Townsville?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that doesn't get finished till
24.
24. Yeah, yeah. Hence this great graphic on
Yes.
David Burke's
Book.
for the,
Well, so the Sunshine Route, let's talk a bit about that. So well, what's the history of the Sunshine Route? Was this one of the first attempts then to market the train trip, the train journey up the coast and to tourists, for tourists?
Probably would have been the most aggressively marketed
Yes.
of the tourist routes here, wouldn't
Yeah,
it?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you see in around about 1935, the whole, I guess, there's a new train introduced, and we're about to see that because the Sunlander is about to be retired and there's new trains to be introduced on the route. But you see this whole new rolling stock which is rolled out, and they were built at the Ipswich Railway Workshops, and these were the most modern pieces of rolling stock promoting the ultimate luxury trip up the coast. Although I note that they decided not to put air conditioning in the train at that particular point in time because it was too expensive to do. But again, you see that whole thing that we see again today. It's about the service. It's about the experience that you might have on the train as part of the experience of your holiday in Queensland. Becomes the train as the experience as much as the destination.
There was also quite a lot of competition, because I might point out that the Silver City Comet that went from Sydney to Broken Hill was air conditioned.
Yes.
When the Sunlander
And it wasn't. That's correct.
The Melburnians are very proud of the spirit of progress. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The poster down here, which I loved, saw tonight, which was in fact a later set of rolling stock, which is the silver rail motor set. The magic carpet ride to Cairns and the silver rail motor set would have been anything but a magic carpet ride, can I say? If any of you have travelled on them, and we do still have a few in operation, but they would have been anything but a magic carpet ride from Brisbane to Cairns in one of those.
What about the inland towns? How much did they owe their existence to the railways, and were they ever promoted as, well, I mean, obviously they are now. It's a great trip out to Longreach, and we've still got the Golflander and the what's the other one?
Westlander,
yes.
Inlander.
Yeah, but were they ever? I mean, we've got this fantastic coastal railway, which is an obvious draw card. What about the inland towns? Did they benefit?
Look, the inland railways, as I was saying, I guess the purpose for their development was much more about bringing produce to port and to market. So that's why you see the three railway networks, I guess Townsville Inland, Rockhampton Inland and Ipswich, later Brisbane Inland, develop first, and then you see the connecting route up the coast. So it was very much about bring that produce to market. But then you do see, as you said, many of those towns then benefit, I guess, from the opportunity that the railway brought to bring people into those places. And in many cases, some of those towns were created by the railway kind of moving forward as it was being built. And their heyday was around that. But then you see those towns continue to prosper and grow.
And Toowoomba would have got quite a bit of tourist trade.
Mhm.
It was about a 5-hour trip, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, Andrew, the other spectacular example would be the Southport, Tweed Heads and Coolangatta line.
Absolutely,
Which that's what opened up what wasn't then called the Gold Coast, but I mean that in effect made all
Absolutely.
those,
That weekend, and again, those trains, I guess, in a suburban passenger sense, and we're talking about long distance before, but in a suburban passenger sense, the network was about then turning from bringing people into the city for work to giving them leisure and recreation opportunities at the weekend.
Yeah.
And so that line down to the Gold Coast carried as many people on the weekend going in the other direction in some respects to have a weekend by the sea.
Well,
as I guess would Shorncliffe and Sandgate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
and also as places to live. We've got the real estate posters over there, and a lot of them advertise the fact that there's a rail line nearby. There's also a poster over there for Mount Coolum and the Coolum Beach, and it says.
I'm very excited by the Coolum poster. It's my favourite one.
So it says accessible by railway.
Yeah.
But I know that railway goes to Nambour.
Yeah, so you know how you've all grown up in the era where the developers were offering to fly you in a helicopter down to the Gold Coast, no obligation, and you'd buy a block of land at Mermaid Beach or somewhere. Well, in the 1920s, the developers of Coolum were saying that Coolum was accessible by rail. So the way Coolum was accessible by rail is you hopped on the train to Nambour, and then you got on the cane tram. And on my calculation, it would only have taken 4 hours to get from Nambour to Coolum on the cane tram. I just love the idea that an advertiser could get away with that sort of.
Did they do it though? Were the cane tram lines used for
Not
passenger
much.
services?
Not much. Yeah, not
You
much.
would- And I mean, it's in a way, let's be nostalgic about a glorious era. I mean, was anybody worrying about the insurance policy of the cane farmers?
No.
No.
But it does point, I think, to that whole thing about accessibility, and you see it again today. Is the land is marketed again around its connections to freeways and other things. So you see, it is about that. It's always been about that accessibility, if you like. And railways were the primary form of transport for people getting to and from work or to and from family and friends. So if it was close to a railway, that was a beneficial.
And also, I guess, Andrew, when you think, I'm not familiar enough with all aspects of the South Coast Line route, but of course, even in the 1920s, you've still got 2 vehicular ferries if you were travelling by road. So, as you appreciate, sometimes even in modern terms, the railway could be quite prompt.
Absolutely.
I noticed on the Coolum poster it says, all the attractions of Coolum, surfing beaches, and it also says there's good shooting, so you bring your gun, when you go up to.
Gosh.
so our reasons for travelling and taking holidays might have changed a bit as well. And I guess back to the place names, because I just think that's interesting. What was the convention in the 19th century for naming places? We've got Brisbane, obviously there was a memorial aspect back then, and a patriotic aspect, and a sense of actually, giving somebody, a memorial in a town.
Yeah, well, I mean, all that, let's just go through. I mean, most of our capital cities in Australia are named after possibly corrupt members of the British aristocracy.
Right.
On the whole.
Such as?
Like our Sydney, etc. I mean, we weren't being very imaginative, or there's a lot of different shown. I mean, all the colonies and then the states set up place name authorities because, of course, you had the issue of street names as well as.
There's a lot of things to name. You would have had, you need a big list. You're just grasping.
And you had things called progress associations in lots of villages and suburbs that often argued viciously for a while about the names. I understand there are still two opposing historical societies around Indooroopilly, for instance.
Right.
So, and sometimes people try and change the names. And of course, you probably know, of course, in World War One, quite a lot of the German names
got changed.
were changed, and they weren't all changed back. Some were, but many
Well,
weren't.
German gardens in Townsville became Belgian gardens.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
that's right. How much do names matter for places? I mean, the places. I mean, we talked earlier about a place adopting a personality, a name, but must be some names that are hard to overcome. Blackwater, Blackpool.
Yeah, I suppose, well, I guess we've all now lived through an era where there's a lot more of what the professionals would call place marketing, which is much more aggressive. I've always been very amused, I know you're not supposed to be amused about this sort of thing, about Brisbane's attempts to find some kind of iconic symbol for itself. Most of you will be very familiar with the fact that until about the late 1960s, the City Hall was the dominant symbol of Brisbane. Regrettably, once the relaxed planning laws meant that the City Hall was completely obliterated from most vistas. Before I forget, there's a marvellous painting by Robert Campbell in the watercolour exhibition at the Queensland Art Gallery at the moment of Brisbane in 1951 with a storm approaching. And you really still get a sense of how central the City Hall was on the landscape. Okay. Then the City Hall just fades from view, and then we've had this unseemly effort to make Brisbane look like a major global city ever since. And it's always a kind of a long shot of the high-rise buildings taken from, say, the naval stores at Kangaroo Point or something like that. And I don't think any of them ever would. I mean, Brisbane's high-rise buildings aren't any more interesting than anybody else's. So and this is we're going to all get smothered with this when the G20 thing happens.
Yes.
Whereas the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast have been more successful, I think, at making images for themselves.
Is it? Are there names that I'm thinking of? Townsville, Bowen. They're not inspiring, but then you've got the Whitsundays and Cairns. I mean, are those? But also the Townsville Bowen names are associated with slightly not as lush tropical as we imagine when we think of Cairns and the Whitsundays. If they were reversed, would we be thinking of Townsville as this lush?
Well, we could I suppose it's a lot of word of mouth, isn't it? It's a combination of what the locals think. How much kind of local ambition there is. I think that varies over time. Andrew will be well aware of nomenclature issues with Ipswich.
Yep.
What does Ipswich stand for in the Ipswich in the Brisbane psyche? We all know it's colder there in winter,
and hotter in summer.
Yeah.
And it once was the capital.
Yes, that's right. It would have been the capital.
So, I guess as I said, Queensland has taken these stretches of coastline as marketing concepts much more aggressively. I mean, if I was, I couldn't say this to a North Queensland audience, of course, I wouldn't be trying to market Cardwell as a safe port myself after Cyclone Yasi.
No, bit of a reputation there, sort of developed.
And they should never have allowed that bloody marina to have been built in the first place. It was a complete failure of town planning to think that you could have a marina in a cyclone zone like that. I mean, so it's interesting then, though, when people you've got, what have you got? You've got the local real estate interests, you have the local members of parliament. You do have difficult booster issues in tourism generally because, every country town wants to think that it's a tourist attraction. But then, of course, over the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of the grey nomads, and Longreach has got a level of sort of centrality in the Australian sort of tourist iconography.
True, yes.
That no one would have imagined that 40 years ago.
No. Now, the John Oxley Library collects not just posters and those real estate maps over there, but and still, Brian, you still buy them though when they come up. Can you just describe how how do you go about? How have you gone about collecting?
I've bought too many.
Brian Randall's the Queensland Places coordinator here at the library, and so, I mean, how do you go about collecting the material, and what do you choose, and you know?
Well, I suppose place. I suppose I was sort of introduced to place through a whole series of interviews I did on the ABC radio with Madonna King, and we sort of did a suburb a week, and so you start with a suburb, and there's a complexity to that. It has its own history, and the history then evolves, and so I think it's a bit subjective, really. It's different things to different people, but I often start with names, and then the way that place is then represented in all the different formats, of which we have many in the John Oxley Library: photographs, artwork, posters, maps, all sorts of things. And then there's the people that populated that area and what they did, and there seems to be an evolution that's then evolves as transport improves, particularly in Brisbane with the suburbs. But it's interesting that teacups, for example, is probably a newer thing we collect, but it's just really another way where a place is visually represented, and but then why were these teacups produced? That was
Why were they produced?
Well,
Brian, where they were produced. I mean, as you know, in the 20s and 30s, a lot were done in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, well, that's right. And Shelley, I've got one there, a Shelley, were very expensive.
Then the Japanese are madly producing our tourism crockery. I haven't worked out just when in the 1950s they start doing it, because there had been a spot of bother, with the Japanese not too long before, but suddenly they get into tourism crockery.
Well, the cheaper variety, I guess. It's mass produced.
Throughout the 50s and early 60s.
Yeah. And then it seems to fade out to some, or the quality. That quality goes down, and then so it seemed to be as this succinct sort of era covered those
Some
few
towns
decades.
were prepared, though, to spend a bit more money on the quality of
That's
their
right.
teacups.
When you could order them, the most famous producer of tourism crockery was a pottery in Sydney called Studio Anna, which ran out of Marrickville from, I think, the early 50s to the early 70s. All their stuff is hand-painted, but any town could order certain, and they're all particular sorts of shapes. You've got little vases, larger vases. You could order the shape you wanted. Of course, in this era, you'll recall a hell of a lot of its tourism stuff. It was actually ashtrays.
Yes.
The funniest Queensland ones are done by a famous Queensland potter called Harry Nemeth, who had a terrific sense of humour, and he'd do an ashtray in the shape of a television. It'd have the Gold Coast on it, and the caption would be, "The only thing we own in the house." This is at a time when everybody's buying stuff on hire purchase, and he sent up aspects of consumerism, but it's tourism crockery. Yeah.
Very kitsch, though. But I noticed some of those teacups over there, they'd have the post office on the side of the teacup.
Well, that's right. Prominent buildings, and again they were, they were major, I suppose, structures in the streetscape. I mean, everybody knew them. They were major visual, the government sort of buildings, the customs house,
Railway stations feature
yeah,
in
that's
some
right,
cases
all that
in
sort of
those
thing,
kind of
main
notable
streets.
public buildings, yeah.
That's right, and there's a few where where companies have produced them to perhaps at the launch of the Mackay Sugar Terminal. There's one there, so there was there was a real. They were really popular at one stage.
They were popular. People collected them.
Exactly, that's
I
right.
guess the towns were just shouting out, "We exist. This is our place."
Yeah, it's interesting though. They're quite rare now, though. I don't know. They're not particularly valuable, but they're quite scarce to find, which is interesting as well. So people must be either hanging on to them or they've been tipped in the rubbish over the years.
So how do you find them? Do you go on eBay?
eBay, antique shops. We did buy one large collection where Erica Hart had purposely collected a whole range of it, so that boosted it, and You know, they don't come up that often. Put it that way.
I
Antique
agree-
shops, you
I
see
agree
them.
all this stuff is getting rarer and rarer. I shouldn't be confessing this in front of Brian and Louise, but I had my biggest ever haul of tourism posters in Melbourne in the early 1990s, where I met the guy who ran the TAA advertising agency, because TAA was run out of Melbourne, as was Ansett, and he let me into their back room. And I just took whatever posters I wanted. But this included silkscreen posters that he'd had there for 30 years. I should explain that over there, quite a lot of the really valuable posters are silkscreen posters, and often only done on very small runs. And no one had ever shown any interest in posters. They better let me take the ones I didn't take multiple copies, but you know, I helped myself.
So where's all this effort going now? You know, there's obviously still posters around, but you can still buy trinkets in gift shops that says, you know, Nambour or Boomerang, I'm imagining, with the name of a place on it. But where is it increasingly going online, this shouting out about place names?
Oh, certainly. You know, we're certainly undertaking digitisation, particularly the estate maps, but across all the formats. I mean, that's a way to broaden access and improve access to the collections. It's a way forward. So, but posters. I mean, we purchase posters, or we acquire posters on an ongoing basis to, I suppose, illustrate Queensland in any of its guises and the way it's represented. So that's ongoing all the time. That's what we're here for.
So I guess back to the tourism, the importance of towns, or the significance of towns as places to visit, and the rise and fall of the railways, and perhaps the rise and fall at some stage of the airlines if petrol prices keep going up. Have towns been bypassed over the years, that, you know, popular tourism destinations, because the railway line didn't go through, or because the railway line was built somewhere else, they just faded?
There's certainly a lot of competing factors, I guess, Ian. And one thing I should have mentioned before is that every state in Australia establishes a government, what's called a Queensland Government Tourist Bureau, New South Wales Government Tourist Bureau in the early 1900s. And these tourist bureaus become really massive booking offices along with the railways.
Yeah.
So the Queensland Tourist Bureau would have had offices in Sydney and Melbourne. Yep. That's where you went to plan your holiday. So if you wanted to come to Queensland, you went to Queensland Government Tourist Bureau in Melbourne, and you'd have all your travel options explained to you. They do your railway bookings for you. It's all, sort of all hard to believe now, because we've gone into an era where all this kind of stuff is now much more privatised, but these were government employees who were booking your holiday, and of course they were quite commercially viable operations, because they were taking a commission on the transport booking, they were taking a commission on the accommodation bookings. They'd tell you what your guest house options were in Coolangatta. No doubt if you're going on a honeymoon, you get quite sensible advice about what kind of guest house you should go to. And they then were subject to massive political pressure by local MPs about which places were being promoted. So there would have been, you know, competition between Toowoomba and Coolangatta and, you know, the original guest house places here, Sandgate. A lot of pressure, and there still is on governments to. So you've got, I suppose, the terrific sort of railway promotion material is then, a lot of the action then goes to the automobile clubs in each state. So they start to publish some of you have still probably got at home, those kind of Roneo strip maps that would tell you, you know, that you couldn't buy any petrol on a Saturday, so you had to buy your petrol on a Friday, you know, that's right. When you get, we get mass car ownership here really in the late 1950s, and that's when the rail passenger
numbers really start to drop.
Right, and then the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast, before they became those, were within driving distance.
Absolutely.
And so there's an economic fluctuation places become more popular depending on the mode of transport and how expensive it is. When I think of, so my family's from Townsville, and so when we plan to go up there, there's three options, I suppose, isn't there? You could fly, take everybody, put them on a plane, drive up, and driving was probably the cheapest option, you know, if you thought about it, if you did it all in one go and didn't have to stay overnight. Or you could catch the train, put the car on the train, and so every time I've looked at it, the prices have changed a bit depending on the price of petrol.
Absolutely.
So you can see a time when the price of petrol gets so expensive that the trains might become a cheaper option.
Cheaper option,
right?
Well,
absolutely.
even today, intriguingly, Andrew, I guess you've still got concessional rates on the trains that the airlines no longer
offer it. That's correct.
So
Yeah.
kids under 16, students on concessions,
Yep, pensioners.
None
Yep.
of the airlines offer any kind of concession structure.
That's
like that
absolutely.
anymore.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's interesting. But I guess when you had the two airline agreement, I should explain to younger persons here that we used to have a government-owned domestic airline. It seems unbelievable now, doesn't it? Called Trans-Australian Airlines. And we had Ansett, A&A, and they had fixed fares. There was no bloody competition at all. And back to
Whatsoever.
your point, Ian,
Yeah.
they were actually bloody expensive to modernise in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They were expensive.
Yes.
So it would be, you would normally fly from, say, Melbourne to the Gold Coast, but your average Sydney family would often drive for the sorts of reasons you're
Yes.
saying. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about, at some stage our transport systems are going to change, and you'd hope, or you'd suspect that trains should come back into their own.
Yeah.
You'd be a bit biased
Oh,
about
look,
that,
absolutely. But I think, the conversation, certainly you've seen that evolving transport solutions really from the very beginnings. And I guess the rise and fall of railways, the rise and fall of airlines, the rise and fall of the car ownership, you see that transport solution evolving. You know, the fact that we're spending, $750 million on putting a tram network back in the Gold Coast means, in some regards, that rail offers solutions into the future for passenger transport. Certainly in the more densely populated areas, in Europe particularly, you see rail competing on its own, and the fact that in many respects the Eurostar service between London and Paris takes up an enormous market share of what previously you couldn't do because of the convenience factor. It competes on time, it competes on price, and it delivers you directly from the centre of the city to the centre of the city, as the airlines can never do. And so you start to see now Australia's got a way to go in terms of that kind of density of population that makes some of those things work. But again, we see people talking about those options now for
that's
Australia.
right. And so you can imagine if you had a fast train service from Cairns all the way down to Melbourne, you might find that suddenly Maryborough is only half an hour by rail, and it becomes a commuting distance quite easily to the centre of Brisbane. And that can change, I suppose, accessibility of Queensland places, and it might cause the demise of others and make others more bigger.
Freeway bypassing
Yes.
would be the classic example.
Yeah.
But we should remind everybody, Andrew, that disgracefully the Southport, Coolangatta and Tweed Heads railway line was abandoned in the early 1960s. And the then Treasurer, 1964, in the Queensland Parliament, told the Queensland Parliament that if workers from the Gold Coast wanted to commute to jobs in Brisbane, they could get a helicopter. I kid you not. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. What a tragedy to have abandoned that
road.
rail line, which of course is now being rebuilt as it should be, but very considerable.
And you've got the anomaly of the North Coast New South Wales line that used to come up to Mooloolumbar, didn't it? And a short distance, relatively speaking, between Mooloolumbar and Tweed Heads, Coolangatta.
Just had to cross a couple of rivers.
But I think that's been discontinued, and you could have had a day trip to Byron Bay, not Queensland, of course, but still. It would have solved the traffic problems there.
There's a very bitter battle in northern New South Wales at the moment between the Toot group, who want to get trains back on Casino to Lismore, Byron Bay, Bangalow and Mooloolumbar, versus a rail trail lobby.
Mm-hmm.
because the rail trail has been very successful in the Brisbane Valley,
Yes.
even more successful in the Clare Valley in South Australia, brilliantly promoted because you can go to a vineyard every 2 kilometres, whether there's compulsory RBT.
This is walking or
Cycling.
Cycling.
And I've just come back from New Zealand, and the
Yes.
Otago Peninsula Rail Trail is, is promoted as a experience all in its own right.
Yeah.
And it's perfect for cycling. Can I say they're perfect for cycling because the gradients are so minimal.
Yeah.
Because they were minimal for the railway, so they become perfect for cycling.
Do you know, Andrew, is the Gympie Railway mob still running the Gympie to Imbil thing on the weekends?
Yep.
Yes, that's one of the best.
A bit up and down, but yep.
Done. I thoroughly recommend it to you. So it's Gympie to Imbil, which is about 40k, and you go through about 4 former dairying towns. It's really a lot of fun.
And they turn you on the turntable at the end.
They
Yep.
turn around on the turntable. They have to turn the engine and the carriages around on the turntable. Yeah.
I suppose when we're talking about railway, we're a bit wistful, aren't we, of that time when it was a bit slower, and it was we were sort of wistful for something we don't have anymore. It's the time. It's the journey rather than the destination, and I think we want that, but it's really hard to get back into that sort of thinking, because if I'm thinking of going to Townsville, I like the idea of the journey. I drove my daughters up there and we stopped off on little towns on the way, and that's what makes these places important. But then, it's tempting just to fly up there a lot cheaper and arrive fresh. Are there any questions? Yes.
You haven't really spoken about Greyhound bus services that was
No.
very prominent that I remember. That was not too long ago, I suppose. But when did they actually start, and how were they really, it seemed to be a price point in between, if you like. Oh, sorry.
A price point in between for families to travel rather than driving yourself, if you had lots of little ones, I suppose, or maybe it was convenient, between sort of rail and flying, which was very expensive at the time. Can you give us...
I'll give you a classic example of a typical schoolboy journey of my youth. I was living in Sydney, so I'd go by myself up to South Brisbane Station on the railway. You'll recall, of course, that that's where the bloody railway ended, South Brisbane Station. Imagine, they don't build the Merivale Bridge until about... There's no rail crossing on this part of the Brisbane River.
That's
I
right.
was telling some people the other day, I love pointing this out, that Brisbane still had some steam trains on its suburban lines in the early 1970s. It was fantastic.
Yes.
It was decayed, it was Hicksville. I thought it was terrific as a kid. Anyway, you get to South Brisbane Station, so I'd then go and stay with one set of grandparents who lived in Wollongabba. Then I get the Greyhound bus to visit the other set of grandparents who'd retired at Buderim. And so it was a Greyhound bus, and of course you knew that the Sunshine Coast was approaching when Tibrogargan loomed over the Greyhound bus. So the pioneer and the Greyhound buses were very important in the 50s and 60s, and as you probably know, they've really made a comeback, particularly with the backpackers, because backpackers will buy you buy a ticket
Pass.
to do all of Queensland or all of Australia for that matter, and it really is quite good value. It's, I can't remember, it's, for $300 or $400 you can actually get round most of Australia on a pre-purchase kind of ticket. And obviously they then also were pretty important in servicing places the train wouldn't get you to.
So was there a connection then with the buses to take you as well? Have you had from train to train, from the train stop then on a bus to go to wherever you were going to?
It was very variable. I mean,
Yeah.
in my case, I was dropped off at what my maternal grandfather described as the Caloundra turn-off. Because buses are still like this. See, otherwise, I might eventually have, say, got to Mooloolaba, but only after the bus had gone into Caloundra, and the Nicklin thing hadn't you know, if the link roads weren't built, this is still an issue for buses today. It's quite interesting as to where they stop. I mean, when you think about the whole Australian railway system, not much of it hugs the coast. Unlike, say, railway systems in Europe, which often hug the coast. You know, if you think about the line from Sydney to Brisbane, it hits the coast at sort of Coffs Harbour and Nambucca Heads, but then it's all
inland.
So it's a geography that's affected the railway line there, has it?
Indeed, yeah. The geography has had back to Andrew's point about the gradients. I mean, they couldn't cope, and of course, the more you stuck to the coast, the more bloody rivers and creeks
You had to cross. Which was, I guess, the challenge in building the Sunshine Route, particularly. I mean, there were two. It's interesting that there were two big railway building projects in this country at roughly the same time. Everyone knows about, in some regards, about the Trans-Australian across the Nullarbor, but the one up the coast to Cairns, in some respects, is equally as big and, in fact, more challenging engineering-wise, because you've got all these rivers and mountains and other things that you're trying to cross. Whereas the Nullarbor, you know, as we all know, has the longest straight bit of track in the world. And so, yeah, it's quite a different story in terms of that coastal.
Why did steamships go out of the tourism business up and down the coast? It'd be nice, wouldn't it, to jump on a steamship or ship from the Brisbane River and go up to Mooloolaba?
It was the main way you got from either Melbourne or Sydney to North Queensland until the rail connection. And of course, you probably know we had very regular services to New Zealand from both Melbourne and Sydney, and to a lesser extent from Brisbane. Cost and time.
Which is the same argument that continues today with discount airlines and, you know, why that's taken over from others.
So some of the more isolated parts of Queensland would have been more accessible by steamship 100 years ago than they are now. I'm thinking of Thursday Island was a popular tourist destination late 19th century, but it's hard to get to now.
And in terms of the rail system, I mean, you'll be getting to a lot more of Queensland as a passenger.
Absolutely.
Than you
can now.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
You started off talking about the state tourist organisation that was set up in Tasmania and New Zealand and then Queensland and other states. We haven't talked very much about getting tourists from overseas. And my memory from London is that, for instance, the Queensland Government Office in the Strand in London would have had the Government Tourist Bureau in there and was pushing holidays in Queensland. So do we know much about the extent to which Queensland was successful in getting overseas tourists to come here in the early days? We know all about what we're trying to do today, but I think it would be an interesting part of Queensland's history to talk about that.
No, it's a very fair point. I mean, all of the states had representation in London. Two little sort of anecdotes I can tell you is that for the Melbourne Olympics in 1956, there was a huge debate about whether even 2,000 Americans would come to Australia. The thing that you always have to think back about is how long did it take to get here? So as you're well aware, about 3 weeks on a Mariposa boat from the west coast of the US, 4 to 5 weeks from a P&O liner from Southampton via the Suez Canal. So one of the problems when the ship is the main means of communication is that you have to have a lot of time on your hands and be reasonably well off to imagine coming to Australia as a tourist. Because it's going to take you 4 or 5 weeks on a ship each way. So it's a big undertaking. The best little statistic I can give you is that in 1962, when they opened the overseas terminal at Circular Quay, it's the one they keep on revamping and putting ever more expensive restaurants in, you know, the overseas terminal at Circular Quay. The year it's opened is the first year that more people fly to Australia than come by ship. So it's hard to get your head around the fact that in the 1950s 50s, we didn't ever get, even late, we didn't get more than 50,000 overseas visitors a year, and now we get 5 million. And as you know, tourist bureaucrats get very anxious if there's a change in the market mix between the Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans and so on. So I guess what I find extraordinary about a lot of that tourism promotion down there, especially when it's aimed at the overseas market, and you'll find some of those posters are published by a mob called the Australian National Travel Association, actually run from Flinders Street
Station. Yes, I noticed that.
Yeah, run from Flinders Street Station. They're our national tourism marketing body, and they publish the monthly magazine Walkabout, that some of you will recall. Very classy monthly magazine early on, started in 1934 from memory. They're kind of preparing, particularly the American market, for a tourist boom that from America doesn't happen until the late 1960s and 1970s, and really doesn't get seriously underway until Paul Hogan's famous prawn on the Barbie ad. So it's a marketing of Australia that isn't paying off in terms of numbers till then. Interestingly.
And a lot of the train journeys that have been offered in recent decades in Australia also targeted that top end, haven't they, Andrew?
Oh, look, absolutely.
Because it's expensive.
And it's about the experience of the train travel, and you were talking about it before. I mean, people kind of hark for that, relaxed atmosphere and a time when there was more time to actually, partake. So you see, particularly even today, the marketing of things like the GAN and the Indian Pacific as, yes, you can make it to Perth in 4 hours or something on the plane, and, you're in Perth and you can start your holiday. But the holiday experience of doing that route by the train, again, the GAN, is promoted quite differently. I mean, Queensland's experience with the Great South Pacific Express is very short-lived, but nonetheless, this luxury train that was built in Townsville as a government project to provide work in the railway workshops in Townsville, and we're talking in the late 1990s here, that then travels from Sydney to Cairns and is promoted as this extraordinary luxury journey, and would have been, I was never fortunate enough to travel on it, but would have been remarkable. Did anyone travel on the Great South Pacific?
No.
On it, yes, okay. And the extraordinary part about that was the way they solved the, the gauge conundrum, is that you arrived on the train in whichever direction you were going at Brisbane, and you were put up in what is now the Sofitel Hotel above the station, while the whole train was taken, 24 carriages and cars were taken to Acacia Ridge, where they were actually lifted and a new set of bogies or wheels was put on the train. They were all lowered again, and then the train would return to take you the next morning on the whichever way you were going. So it's one amazing example, I guess, of how we potentially solved that problem. But the market was seen to be coming from Sydney, because Sydney was the kind of gravity point.
Based on the success of cruise ships, in a sense. And
that whole rail cruising. It only lasted about 3 or 4 years, because about 1999 it comes in. You then have the SARS epidemic, which takes the high-end travel out of the market. You then have September 11 in 2001, which killed the American market for travel particularly. And it was very much aimed at that top end of the market, and so drops out of service, I think, around about 2003. But yes, again, it was about that travel experience, and that rail was again a form of cruising, if you like. And we see the enormous growth in cruise market in Australia today.
That's right. At the
where
moment,
you see, I think for the first time ever, we'll have more than 1 million cruise ship passengers.
So there's a market there, isn't there, for the slow journey, the journey itself, not the destination. So do you foresee a time when the Great South Pacific Express could be brought out of mothballs, Andrew, at the Ipswich
more pertinent
shops?
Is whether Clive Palmer's Titanic ever floats.
Clive Palmer.
Yes,
Maybe
there
he
you
could turn
go.
his attention
Yeah.
to the Great South Pacific Express. Well, look, thanks very much. We're a little bit over time, but if you'd like to thank with me Peter Spearritt and Andrew Moritz.
Thank you.
Now, if you've got a few minutes, it's really worth having a look at those posters over there. The real estate ones, I think, are fascinating.
And I just draw your attention to the Gert Selheim posters. They're the ones that are worth the most on the collector's market. Louise and Brian didn't want me to tell you that. But this guy Gert Selheim has done a fantastic poster of 3 fishes for the Barrier Reef. He's an Estonian migrant, a graphic designer, and he did the first, that one there, he did the first Qantas logo, this guy. Australia's most important ever logo, did the first Qantas logo.
So they're works of art in themselves, really worth having a look at. Thank you very much.
Thank you.